Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The Greeks come before the Romans, both in this series of lectures on ancient Greek and Roman historiography and as in all accounts of the ancient world. But that priority is not a historical datum. On the contrary, the city-states of Athens and Rome came into being at much the same time. However, in the discussion of ancient literature, it is a valid ordering, and it is, in some sense, inevitable, because uniquely, starting in the 8th century BC, Greeks used the medium of alphabetic writing, not just for lists or laws or epitaphs, but also to preserve the songs of epic bards, the Homeric poems, and in time, the poems of Hesiod, and in time after that, the lyric poets. And so they created a literature. Neither the Latins nor, as far as we know, their Etruscan neighbors did this until many centuries later in the 3rd century BC. It is not that the Latins and Etruscans were backward, however, or even peripheral. Horace's famous lines on the rude farmers of the Roman Republic, wholly unknowing of Greek culture until the peace that followed the Punic Wars, is demonstrable nonsense. Of course, classicists want to believe what a classic author tells them, but a few archaeological glimpses of the archaic world of Latium and southern Etruria will help us to overcome this mindset. So what I'm going to give you now is just kind of a very brief overview of some of the archaeological evidence that proves to us that the Italians, the early Romans, did have deep exposure to the Greeks and to Greek culture from a much earlier time than the 3rd century. The earliest alphabetic Greek inscription known from anywhere was scratched onto a pot about 800 BC in an Iron Age community in Latium, just 20 kilometers, about 12 and a half miles, really, east of Rome. And Greek potters from the island of Euboea can be detected working at Veii, that is the city of Veii just to the north of Rome, in the 8th century BC. In the mid-7th century, one Kleiklos, a Greek artisan, is attested on a Corinthian vase in the Esquiline Hill, that is the cemetery on the Esquiline Hill at Rome. And another Greek by the name Aristonathos painted the blinding of Polyphemus on a mixing bowl made for an Etruscan worthy at Caere, also not too far away from Rome. Other Greeks known as living and working in Etruria at that time include one named Larth Tecles and Rutile Hippocrates. In the 6th century BC, Ionians and Samians, that is, Greeks from Ionia and the island of Samos, were frequenting the trading post of Gravisca about the same time as a bronze plaque attests the cult of the Dioscuri at Lavinium, which is just outside of Rome. While at Rome itself, an Attic black figure crater showing Hephaestus appears on the volcanal, and a terracotta statue group portrays the apotheosis of Heracles at the Forum Boarium. These are just the most striking examples of an archaeological record which led its most authoritative interpreter, one Massimo Palatino, to the following conclusion. He said, quote, "The effect of the refined Ionian, that is Greek civilization, on the cities of Tyrrhenian Italy is widespread and deeply felt in the second half of the 6th century BC. We could even say that there comes into being a genuine cultural and artistic koine, consisting equally of the Greek colonies and the Campanian, Latin, and Etruscan centers." So it should be no surprise that for as early as Hesiod in the Theogony, that we see references, for instance, to Latinos, an eponym of the Latins and ruler of the famed Etruscans, being the son of Circe and Odysseus. Circe's island was traditionally held to be just off the coast of Latium, directly across the water from the north coast of Sicily, where in the early 6th century lived the greatest poet of the Greek West, Stesichorus of Himera. Though he wrote in lyric meter, Stesichorus's grandeur and ambitious heroic narratives put him in almost the same category as Homer himself. Actually, the ancient literary critic Longinus refers to him as Homerikotatos, which means most Homeric. And Quintilian also refers to him saying that his poetry redundant et effunditor. It is kind of sonorous and flowing. A later source, not necessarily untrustworthy, says that Stesichorus related Aeneas's voyage to the west, and in the past 50 years or so, discoveries have revealed much of his poem, the Geroianus, the narrative account of Heracles' 10th labor, which ultimately uh, lay beyond the and behind the Roman story of Hercules' meeting with Evander that one reads about in Book 9 of the Aeneid. Indeed, Palentum, that area where Aeneas meets Evander in the Aeneid, this is mentioned in the Geroianus, and one of the versions of that poet's life, of the life of the poet Stesichorus, says that he was born in Palantion in Greece, but then went into exile just like Evander himself. And if that reflects the characteristic biographical method of borrowing episodes from an author's work as if they were evidence for his life, which is typical of ancient biography of writers, perhaps we might even infer that the Roman story goes back to Stesichorus himself. Of course, we do not know enough to assert that, but it is not inconceivable. The point, though, is that Rome and early Greek poetry did not exist in separate worlds. And the same is true of early Greek prose. Those Ionian dedications at Gravisca that I mentioned a moment ago were set up by people not unlike the pioneer Logopoios Hekateus of Miletus, who we encountered in our lecture on Herodotus, and whose map of the earth, whose circuit of the earth, included, of course, Western Italy. And not only the predictable islands of Elba and Capri and so on, but also inland centers like Nola and Capua in Campania. Rome would not have been beyond his scope, therefore. In the early 5th century, maybe when Promathion of Samos wrote his Italica, which contained the earliest version of the Romulus legend, and an unknown author of the Cumaean Chronicle, which probably dealt with the descendants of Demaratus of Corinth, who ruled in Rome, may also belong to this period. Towards the end of the 5th century, Hellanicus of Lesbos reported a view of Rome's origin as being founded by Aeneas with Odysseus, which, from a modern scholarly perspective, looks like a combination of two separate traditions that already existed. Hellanicus also seems to have known some Latin, since his account of Heracles' return with the cattle of Gorion includes a derivation of Italia from the Latin word vitulus, meaning calf. He may have regarded Latin as a Greek dialect, which was not an uncommon view in antiquity. Certainly in the 4th century BC, Heraclides of Pontus called Rome a, quote, Hellenic polis, and even Aristotle believed that it had been founded by Achaeans, that is, Greeks blown off course by storms in their return from Troy. Aristotle's most beloved student, Theophrastus, knew the Roman colony of Cercyon, where the inhabitants pointed out the tomb of Elpenor, one of the characters that one encounters in the Aeneid, and his circumstantial report of a Roman attempt to found a city in Corsica. That shows that he was well informed about this interconnection. So, if you put it all together, everything that I've been laying out, we have visual evidence, we have engraved bronze mirrors and kistae, that is chests, which attest the thorough familiarity of Latin and Roman craftsmen with Greek artistic traditions. We have inscribed names on some of the scenes depicted on these artifacts that show a knowledge of Greek mythology in Latium. And even in the 3rd century, Eratosthenes of Cyrene found it natural to include Romulus, son of Ascanius and grandson of Aeneas, in his chronological researches. And it is not at all paradoxical that his contemporary, the Greek poet Callimachus, used the story of, quote, Gaius the Roman to illustrate the virtues of Pan-Hellas. This he does in his great poem, the Aitia, Book 4, 106. It is clear then, if you reflect on all of this information, that as far back as our information extends, more than half a millennium before Horace imagined the dawn of Greek consciousness in Rome, and in Greek literature, Rome and her Latin and Etruscan neighbors were an integral part of the Greek world. Well, since this is a course on Greek and Roman historiography, and now we are shifting really to Roman historiography, we must ask the question, what effect did all of this have, and this interpenetration of Greek culture among the Latins from an early time, what effect did all of that have on the Romans' perception of themselves and on their historical consciousness? Well, whether or not the expulsion of the Tarquins was inspired by that of the Pisistratids, the Romans must have been aware of the parallel. The early republican cult of Liber may well have been influenced by the Athenian Dionysius Eleutherios. Much more certain is the influence of the Solonian law code on the 12 tables of ancient Roman law, which is visible even in the fragments that survive. Moreover, there are many, many structural elements in the history of the early republic, as we have it preserved in the writers Livy, who we're going to be having a whole lecture on soon, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek writer of early Roman history. There are many, many parallels and structural elements that seem to parallel events in Roman history with ones that are attested, very well attested in Greek history, and all of which strongly suggest an influence of kind of an overlay or a kind of reading of Roman history through the lens of Athenian events. For instance, the attack of Porsenna, so as to restore Tarquin, the kings of Rome, that parallels nicely the story of the Spartans' attempt to restore Hippias. The exile of Collatinus parallels the ostracism of Hipparchus. The exile of Coriolanus parallels the ostracism of Themistocles, and the 300 Fabii dying at the Battle of Corumena, of course, is very much analogous to the last stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, and one can go on and on and on. The cults of the Spartan Dioscuri in the Forum and of Arcadian Pan at the Lupercal, and the chapels of the Argives, listed in a liturgical document quoted by Marcus Terentius Varro, an antiquarian of the 1st century BC, show that Athens was not the only influence, but by the end of the 4th century, Athenian imperial democracy may well have seemed a particularly appropriate paradigm for the Roman Republic's domination of central Italy. It certainly was at the time of the Samnites Wars that the statue of Alcibiades, the bravest of the Greeks, was erected in the Comitium in Rome, which we read about in Pliny the Elder, Natural Histories 3426. That choice of Alcibiades to erect there implies familiarity with Greek historiography, particularly a lot of the authors we've been studying, Thucydides, Xenophon, Ephorus of Cumae. And there is reason to suppose that some Romans also read a group of local historians of Athens who wrote from the 5th to the 3rd century BC that are collectively referred to by modern historians as Athedographers. Again, these local historians of Athens, whose narratives of the long history of their city's political development conspicuously prefigured the later historiography of Rome. A particularly revealing parallel is the description of one of these Athedographers, one Clydemus, of Theseus's battle with the Amazons in what was in historical times the middle of Athens. The topographical details are used as evidence in just the same way as the Lacus Curtius and the Eupator Stator Temple of Rome are used in the story of Romulus's battle with the Sabines in what was in historical times the middle of Rome. Clydemus was probably what the Greeks would have called an exegetes, that is, a religious specialist who gave advice for conducting cultic rituals. And he would have used his cultic expertise to create the material for his history. In Rome, the analogous kind of version of that are what are called the annales, the yearly annalistic writing of the pontifices, or the priestly colleges of ancient Rome, who wrote about prodigia et monstra, that is, these kind of miraculous or miraculous events, omens, comets. If there was an animal that was born with two heads or something like that, that was a monstrum. That was a sign from the gods of some kind of event that was going to take place, some kind of some kind of omen. And that is where a word monster comes from, incidentally. But the point, though, is that these would have been written down year by year by these priests of ancient Rome. And these annales, these yearly writings, were considered by Cicero, for instance, in his writings, to be very much fundamental for the development of Roman historiography. They may have begun in as early as 300 BC with the creation of the reformed colleges of pontifices. They were reformed at that time to now include plebeian members. This we read about in Livy, Book 10, Chapter 9, too. It is usually thought, though, by scholars such as Tim Cornell, that the Annales began much earlier than that, but the main evidence for that position, namely Cicero's De Republica 125, has been shown to be textually unreliable. And in any case, it may be thought unlikely that the unreformed patrician college that existed before 300 had been interested in making its knowledge public. So we can be more sure that at least by 300 is really when the annales stretch back to. None of them, of course, survive anymore, but they did exist for our sources from antiquity. A similar point may be made about another potential source of historical information, the annual list of magistrates. These were lists that existed after the power-sharing compromise of the year 367, known as the Sextii Licinii laws, which required the election of at least one plebeian consul each year. And the Romans told their year by who were the consuls. There would be two of them elected every year, and that's how they tell time. So, they would have all known that if somebody mentioned this took place in the consulship of Gaius Julius Caesar and Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, everybody would have known what year that was. We need a footnote for that in the text that we read, but in antiquity, they would have all known that meant 59 BC. So these begin roughly around this time, also in the 4th century. However, magistrate lists may have reached back actually as early as the very start of the Republic, with the expulsion of the Tarquins, and they are argued to have been available to the historians of the 1st century BC. And to whoever created the sequence of consuls and triumphs inscribed on Augustus's triumphal arch, they were certainly available to him, because he puts them back, going all the way back to the earliest times, that is to 509 BC. And it is usually thought that they are broadly reliable. Again, Tim Cornell, in his book on the early period of Rome. But if the reforms of 367, the Licinii Sextii laws, marked the final achievement of a kind of polis constitution, which required formal record keeping, it may well be doubted whether the patrician magistrates of the previous 140 years felt the need for such an archive. We know that some later historians, faced with an absence of authentic record for the years before the Gallic sack of Rome in 387 were driven to the conclusion that the Gauls had burned the city and all the records had perished in the fire. That is something that one sees in some of the fragmentary historians of ancient Rome. But in fact, the archaeological evidence shows that there was no fire. The suspicion must be, therefore, that what passed for the early Republican magistrate lists in, say, Livy's time, late 1st century BC, was in fact the result of mere antiquarian scholarship of the same kind as that of the Athedographers, who reconstructed the earliest Athenian archon list. In other words, the earliest, the first 140 years or so, really until the middle of the 4th century, or even, yeah, into the middle of the 4th century, really is kind of, it's very dubious as to the degree that those magistrate lists, those annual magistrate lists, are actually accurate. It happens to be recorded again in Pliny that in the year 304, the aedile, that is the political office holder of the aedileship, Gnaeus Flavius, set up a shrine to the goddess Concordia to mark the reconciliation of the orders, the plebeians and patricians. And that in the inscription to this shrine, he dated it to the year 204 years post Capitolinam aedem dedicatam, after the dedication of the Capitoline temple. That may imply that the only way of counting the years before the year 367, the year of the Sextii Licinii laws, was by a very interesting ritual that has no correspondence in anything Greek, but it does in among the Etruscans, of nailing in a nail to the wall of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitol. Livy talks about this in Book 7, Chapter 3, 5. Every year, a new nail would be driven in. And so that great monument kind of was the sort of much more so than even the change in political constitution that took place in 509. The Romans, when they historical consciousness at Rome was linked much more with buildings and cults than with notions of constitutional change, however important that would become later on. And so that is really our firmest dating picture. That is the kind of greatest index of historical consciousness that existed in archaic Rome. That Athedographer that I was referring to a moment ago, Clydemus, he was writing in the middle of the 4th century BC. And whether or not his work in particular was influential at Rome is unknown, but it now seems clear that it was in the generation after that, that is, that pivotal period at the turn of the 4th and 3rd centuries, that the main outlines of Roman history were formed. Well, how that came about is a question fraught with methodological difficulty. What can we know about the communal memory of a pre-literary society? When all our evidence comes from much later literary texts, whose authors, like Horace, had little or no understanding of it. Any hypothesis can only be tentative, but even so, there are hints in our literary sources that may help us to imagine some aspects of the Rome of 300 BC. The most famous such item, which was first exploited by the Dutch scholar Perizonius in the year 1685, is Cicero's reference to a passage in the elder Cato's Origenes about a custom, obsolete in Cato's own time, of guests at banquets singing songs to the music of a pipe in praise of famous men. That is the quote he gives. Modern scholarship is divided on the value of this evidence, which on the one hand is certainly consistent with what we know of the archaic symposium, but on the other might be just Cato's exploitation of Greek antiquarian scholarship about the archaic past. My own view is that it may well have been a genuine memory from the pre-literary world, offering an insight into how the past was remembered in one stratum of Roman society. One might imagine that banquets where the friends and relatives of say an Appius Claudius or a Quintus Fabius were gathered, were not unlike those implied by the poetry of the early Greek elegists, with the values of an aristocratic elite being rehearsed and reinforced by the example of admired ancestors. Aristocrats also had more public ways of making sure the deeds of their ancestors were remembered. Cicero, again in his work, The Brutus, chapter 62, refers to the survival of early funeral orations. And Livy, in Book 8, chapter 42, he refers to the inscriptions attached to ancestral portraits. And the earliest Scipionic epitaphs give us an idea of the sort of information that might be transmitted. For instance, Scipio Barbatus, an inscription that you could look at. The fact that both Cicero and Livy thought it was unreliable needs not concern us. What matters is the creation of communal memory through the pride of noble families. Was that all there was? Well, one influential modern view holds that the creation of the Roman historical tradition was solely the work of the elite, as if the Roman ruling class were identical with the Republic. But since the Latin word for Roman history is res gestae populi Romani, which literally means the deeds of the Roman people, a phrase we see, for instance, in Sallust and in Livy, this can hardly be true. The deeds of the noble leaders do indeed feature prominently in the later historical tradition, but they do not monopolize it. So where should we look for the communal memory of the people as a whole? It may be helpful to apply to the citizens of Rome something that the ancient Greek travel writer Pausanias wrote about in the 2nd century AD regarding the Athenians, who believed that their democracy was set up by the mythical Theseus. As Pausanias rather snobbishly comments in Book 1, Chapter 3, quote, "There are many false beliefs current among the mass of mankind, since they are ignorant of historical science and consider trustworthy whatever they have heard from childhood in choruses and tragedies." End quote. The choruses he refers to here are what interest us, because what he's referring to here were part of everyday experience, hymns in honor of the gods at the sacrifices and rituals that were familiar to every adult and child in a polis. Plato says much the same thing about, quote, stories repeated in prayers at sacrifices. He says this in the Laws 887d. So I think we are entitled to use Pausanias here as evidence for more than just his own time and place, because Plato was writing 600 years earlier. There are 3 passages in that writer Dionysius of Halicarnassus's History of Early Rome, where the author alludes to hymns still sung in Rome in his time, and he's writing basically in the close of the 1st century BC. In his book 1:31-2, he refers to Faunus, king of the Aborigines, that is, natives of Italy. He refers to him as, quote, "a man of prudence as well as energy, whom the Romans in their sacrifices and songs honor as one of the gods of their country," end quote. Again, in Book 1, Chapter 79:11, Dionysius comments that the young Romulus and Remus were looked on as offspring of the gods, quote, "and as such they are still celebrated by the Romans in their hymns, in the hymns of their country," end quote. And again, Dionysius, Book 8, Chapter 62:3, he says of Marcius Coriolanus, quote, "though nearly 500 years have already elapsed since his death down to the present time, his memory has not become extinct, but he is still sung and hymned by all as a pious and just man." A possible context for the first of these may be the sacrifice to Faunus at Tiber Island on the 13th of February, a holiday that we know existed then. For the second, either the Lupercalia, 2 days later, which was a scene of the suckling of the twins, or the Parilia, the anniversary of the foundation of the city, on April 21st. And for the third, the sacrifice to Fortuna Muliebris at the 4th milestone of the Via Latina on July 6th. It is not necessary to suppose that the hymns Dionysius knew in the late first century were themselves archaic compositions. The mere fact that such hymns were sung at Roman sacrifices is enough to attest one more traditional source of communal memory, this nascent historical consciousness. Tragedies also, according to Pausanias, were the other main source of the ordinary Athenians' historical knowledge. Here, too, there is a Roman analogy. Plautus, the Roman playwright, in his Amphitryon, lines 41 through 44, makes a casual remark that gods in tragedies regularly reminded the audience of the good things they have done for Rome. And this suggests plays on Roman historical themes. No doubt these would have been the fabulae praetextae, discussed by historians of Roman drama from Varro onwards. Since the earliest praetexta plays, which our sources refer to, are written by Naevius, particularly his play The Clastidium, on the single combat of the consul Marcellus with a Gallic king in 222 BC. Modern scholars have usually inferred that this genre was an invention of Naevius himself, and no doubt that is true as far as literary drama is concerned. The question is, was there drama before there was literature? One revealing piece of evidence is Varro's citation of a play on a quasi-historical subject, not by the author's name or even the title, but by the context of its performance. This is in Varro's work on language 6:18. The people were taught the reason for this by the togata praetexta presented at the games of Apollo, end quote. What matters here is the assumption that performances at the theater games teach the people. The particular play Varro refers to can hardly predate 212 BC, when the Ludi Apollinares were inaugurated, but the principle may well date back to before our imagined 300 BC horizon, since the Ludi Romani certainly, and the Ludi Plebii, Cereales, and Liberales, these are all these athletic festivals that were religious in nature, probably were already in existence at that time. Moreover, it is clear from the iconography of the bronze mirrors and cistae that I mentioned earlier that Latins and Romans in the 4th century BC were familiar with dramatic performance in a Dionysiac context, which might even involve the plots of, say, Euripidean tragedies. So it may well be that when the citizens of Rome gathered at the games in honor of their gods, Jupiter Optimus Maximus at the Ludi Romani and Plebii, Ceres, Liber, and Libera at the others, they were taught what they needed to know about the gods, about their rights and duties, and about the history of their city by exemplary narratives presented in dramatic form. As always, such an inference can only be a provisional hypothesis, but it is at least consistent with the little that we do know about plays presented in the later Rome of our literary sources, which dealt with divine punishment of wrongdoers. The power of the gods is revealed on earth, the miraculous ways in which the Romans of the past overcame their enemies, and the rewards of victory as manifested in the triumphal celebrations. It is, therefore, I think, reasonable to assume that much of Rome's communal memory consisted of what the citizen body saw regularly performed before their eyes. The very fact that later historians might suspect material in their sources of having been invented for the stage is enough to confirm that dramatic performance was one of the ways in which historical knowledge could be created and perpetuated. There were, of course, other ways, which hardly need argument, the instruction of the young by parents and teachers, for example, or the commercial activity of professional storytellers. But the context suggests, from everything I've just outlined, that preserving the remembered past of the leading families or of the citizen body as a whole may be more important than any of these other considerations as possible conduits for the historical tradition of the Roman people. In his preface to the Lays of Ancient Rome, Lord Macaulay notes with regret that the Romans never sought out and recorded examples of oral poetry in order to prevent them from being forgotten. But Macaulay was wrong. It seems that at least one such collection was indeed made, a book of very ancient carmina, that is poetry, which was said to have been put together before anything written in Latin. This is a phrase, offhanded remark by Macrobius in his Saturnalia, Book 5, Chapter 20, 18. Now, only scraps of this Carmina survive, preserved in learned authors from Varro to Macrobius, but some of them may be of interest for our subject. Here, for instance, is a quasi-Homeric moment quoted by Festus, a grammarian and rhetorical author of the 2nd century A.D., where he quotes these vetera carmina, these very old songs. But now Aurora, withdrawing from the sky, reveals her father. That is the quote. That must be from a narrative poem, as perhaps was the line quoted by Varro in his De Vita Populi Romani. Quote, there the shepherds hold the consualia games with hides, end quote. The reference is evidently to Consus's altar in the valley north of the Aventine. That was where the Sabine women were abducted at the Consualia on August 21st in the first year of Rome, the so-called rape of the Sabine women. So the shepherds may well be Romulus's men. Two other Carmina were certainly narrative, one entitled Priam, again, Varro's work on language, book 7, 28, and Nellius, which is referred to by Festus. Priam's scepter was one of the divine talismans of Rome, and Nellius was one of a pair of divinely begotten twins who were exposed, rescued, and brought up in secret before freeing their mother from servitude. The parallel with Romulus and Remus extends even to the cradle, which featured in the recognition scene. The most important feature of these tantalizingly enigmatic fragments is their anonymity, which suggests that they did indeed originate in a world before authors. The transition to literature proper is marked by the Carmen Belli Punici, the poem about the Punic War, which is always attributed in our sources to its author Gnaeus Naevius. This was a poem of which the written text was preserved, but even so, it was not designed primarily for reading. Before Gaius Octavius Lampadio divided it into 7 books, it existed as a continuous script, Suetonius tells us in his work on grammarians, book 2, chapter 2, which I think means that Naevius wrote it for recitation in the traditional way. The script was his personal property, not copied until after his death. Naevius's Carmen is an important milestone, therefore, in the development of Roman historical consciousness, no doubt bigger, better, and more comprehensive than any of its predecessors. It must have taken 5 or 6 hours to deliver. Its audience of Roman citizens at the Ludi Romani, perhaps, will have learned about Aeneas's flight from Troy, Jupiter's prophecy of Roman greatness, the origins of Carthage and its enmity with Rome, the foundation of Rome by Aeneas's grandson Romulus, and the course of the great Punic War in which the poet himself had fought. Aeneas was right about Naevius's Saturnian meter, quote, in which of old the fauns and prophets sang. It was indeed a traditional form, but it was used at a high level of literary sophistication, and Naevius's poem deserves to be thought of as the first true history of Rome. This is not just my opinion either. This is the opinion of Tim Wiseman, one of the greatest scholars of Roman historiography of the modern period. There was another form of literary sophistication, however, which despised the historical epic and its mass audience. Those who knew the Greek historians knew Thucydides' pointed contrast that he makes in his first book, chapter 21, and again in chapter 22, between the performances of poets and logographoi on the one hand, competing for a particular audience's favor, and his own historical research on the other hand, which entrusted to a written text would be a possession forever. Tema es ae. The Hannibalic War was a time when men might well remember Thucydides and his insistence that the war he narrated was the greatest and most terrible in history. No doubt that had been true 2 centuries earlier, but the Romans knew it was true no longer. Even so, the first historiae of Rome were not, or not only, Thucydidean war narratives. Fabius Pictor, for instance, and Quincius Alimentus, and Postumus Albinus, too, in the next generation, were the authors of the earliest kind of prose histories of ancient Rome, whose works don't survive except in the most meager fragments. They were all Roman historians who all wrote their histories in the Greek language, not in Latin. Despite authoritative opinion to the contrary, such as by Eric Gruen, who is also a great scholar of ancient Roman history, the fact that they were all Roman senators and yet they wrote in Greek must mean that at least they hoped for a Greek readership. This has been a very vexed question. Why was it that they did not write in their own language? Why was it that they wrote in Greek? Obviously, there are linguistic reasons for that. The Latin language was not yet as highly sophisticated as it would become later on under the influence of historiography, Greek historiography, philosophy, and oratory, and so on. But it didn't have the technical vocabulary at all for a lot of these subjects. And that is certainly a valid point to make in explaining why it was that they did write in Greek and not Latin. But also, one also must acknowledge the fact that they must have hoped for a Greek readership on some level. Since the year 1974, scholars have known that Fabius Pictor's history began with the coming of Heracles into Italy. That was when a fragment was unearthed. That tells us this. And Plutarch tells us in his Life of Romulus, chapter 3:1, and again in chapter 8:7, that Fabius Pictor's detailed and theatrical narrative of the overthrow of Amulius, the wicked uncle of Romulus and Remus, was taken from a Greek author, one Diocles of Peparethus. That third Latin author, well, I'm sorry, Roman author writing in Greek, Postumus Albinus, whom I just mentioned, is likely to be responsible for casting the victory of his ancestor Aulus Postumus at Lake Regillus into the purely Homeric narrative, followed by Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Now that all looks like prima facie evidence that these authors were writing for an international Greek-speaking audience who would have all been expecting Greek literary references and cultural, anchors inside of the text. Part of their motive for doing so, for writing in Greek, was no doubt to present Rome in a sympathetic light. Fabius Pictor will have presented Heracles as the ancestor not only of himself, but also of the great commander who defied Hannibal. One of the few surviving items of Quincius's history reassuringly presents the Roman ruling class as a strong oligarchy trusted by the people. The Senate decrees the execution of Spurius Maelius without trial and entrusts the deed to Servilius Ahala, who takes a sword and cuts Maelius down in the forum. The citizens are indignant, but when he shouts that he has killed a tyrant by order of the Senate, they accept the sentence without demur. So this is a very Greek kind of thing to do. This is the sort of thing that Harmodius and Aristogeiton, of course, did, some of the greatest heroes of Athenian history, the tyrant slayers. One can hardly imagine Naevius, that scourge of the nobility, as Aulus Gellius called him in Book 3, Chapter 3:15, telling the story of the Roman people in quite those terms. And of course, there were other differences too between the Saturnian bard and the Hellenizing historians. Arnaldo Mamiliano, again, one of the greatest historians of scholars of Greek and Roman historiography of the 20th century, says, quote, Naevius, by choosing to write a poem rather than a history, did not submit the Roman past to the process of rational elucidation in the interest of truth, which is characteristic of Greek historiography, end quote. But there is no need to privilege one style over the other. It was a combination of their methods and their prejudices that defined the past of a city which in their day had already seen a century and a half of military struggle and success. 3 centuries of creative tension between the respective interests of the many and the few, and more than half a millennium, with, again, to bring everything back to the opening quotation I gave from Horace, more than half a millennium of varied cultural evolution under the heavy influence of Greek culture. And therefore, in conclusion, it is not surprising that the resulting tradition of Roman historiography was so rich and complex. Thank you.